webinars. The chat function is open. Please, on the chat, let us know where you're from. We communicate, we engage, we share details. If you want people to contact you on LinkedIn, please feel free to share your LinkedIn details there as well. The reactions are open here today. So if you have a look at your reactions button and you like what it is that we're saying, please give a thumbs up, give a clap. It's really lovely having everybody online today. We are at the top of the hour, so I would like to kick off. And today we're talking about, I said poorly performing boards, but really underperforming boards and looking at revitalizing boards. So there's nobody better, I think, that can talk to us about how to do this and on the topic than Professor Mervyn King. Prof, lovely to have you here with us today. Perhaps you can give us a little bit of an introduction into this topic about revitalizing boards.
Well, yes, thank you, Carolyn, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody online, wherever you're from. What I'll do, Carolyn, in answer to your question, is talk about my own experience. You can Google and find many cases of underperforming boards and how chairmen have gone about correcting it. So I'm going to talk about the Frame Textile Group, which was then the largest textile company in the Southern Hemisphere. I'm going back about 35 years ago. It was underperforming, and I was asked to become the new chairman. So I was the new chairman with an underperforming board. The company was in fact performing, spinning yarn, weaving fabric, which was its business, but into stock. It wasn't being sold. Well, if you carry on like that, it's a recipe for disaster. So I was asked to chair this board and try and correct the company, which in that year made a 450 million rand loss. So in today's terms, probably 4.5 billion rand loss. But it was a huge organization with factories from Blantyre down to Cape Town. So I became chair. The first thing I did was do a skills audit on each director and what he or she's competencies were. And if they were very competent and had a history, a good reputation, the question was, do they have the capacity to sit in this company? Because some directors are very competent and very popular, and they take on too many appointments. And they don't actually go do their homework properly, the duty of care, diligence. They skim, and I don't want to do it like that. So do a skills audit of my board, then looked at the MOI, in those days, Articles of Association. But today, MOI in South Africa, Memorandum of Incorporation. Does the board have the power to dismiss and appoint directors subject to round-robin resolutions? Very important if you want to have a board which is underperforming and you want to reorganize that board. So I had an Articles of Association which allowed the board to appoint and dismiss subject to a round-robin, which would be approved at the next special or general meeting of the board. Then I had a look at the MOI to see if there were dispute resolution mechanisms. And there were, and the most important thing is that it was conciliation. Now, conciliation is different from mediation. Mediation is the mediator tries to get the two parties to agree when there is a dispute. So the two disputants come together and the mediator tries to get them talking and to come to a resolution. The conciliator does the same, only the conciliator is a person who's steeped in that area of business and knowledgeable, and actually suggests an answer to the dispute, to the two disputants. And they discuss that, and he guides them to try and get to that, answer. So with all that in place, I then arranged to have an offline Bosbarat in South African terms, meeting with the directors, which took many days. I wanted to discuss with them the long-term objective. What was our long-term objective? Our long-term objective was that we had over 30,000 employees from Blantyre in Malawi down to Cape Town in various towns and cities. And the deceased, who was the major shareholder and through his trust, had appointed 3 directors almost for life. And they were not competent. And so I called on them to resign, which they refused to do. And there had to be litigation, which eventually we had them removed from the board through historic litigation, actually it was, because it was differing from the terms of the testator in his will. But we succeeded in that, and then started reconstituting the board from a skills point of view. But the offline discussions, we agreed the long-term objective, which became molded in gold at the end of the line, and we never differed from that. We always focused on that long-term objective, which was to close factories from Blantyre down to Cape Town, because what the deceased, and he had ceded those thoughts to these 3 directors, was that you don't destroy old machinery, plant and machinery. You move it to areas where you get subsidized by the state to start business, to create jobs there. So, for example, he moved it to what was then the homelands under the apartheid era. And he had subsidized wages, so he had this paper-thin margin, but he never destroyed plant and machinery. So we had 32,000 employees from Blantyre down to Cape Town. But the company was going south because it was manufacturing into stock instead of manufacturing to sell. And the bottom line was showing that it was actually heading for disaster. Anyway, I went offline with these directors and discussed with them the long-term objective was to get the manufacturing, the spinning of yarn, the weaving of fabric, the design to become computer-aided. So I'm going back 35 years ago, which you could in those days. Much more advanced today, but computer-aided, of course, we had about 27 artists drawing patterns, taking ages drawing patterns. For example, and many online will remember the Waverley blanket. We made Waverley blankets with all those designs for, especially for Basotho. And so the idea was to get the company, the manufacturing heart of the company, back into Durban, its original place. There was adequate factory space just in Durban alone for modern plant and machinery, which could produce the same amount of yarn and fabric as was being produced from Blantyre down there. We, in our discussions and strategy, brought it down to 4,200 people from 32,000 people. So that was our long-term objective, and that was agreed to offline, eventually agreed to at a board meeting. What were the key risk indicators and what were the key performance indicators in doing all this? Well, of course, one of the risks was retrenching all these people. And we caused one weaving shed to be absolutely cleaned out of all the old weaving plant in the Durban area. And we started an organization called Zenzalini. So as we retrenched people, we bought sewing machines and taught them how to make simple garments, t-shirts, pajamas, and supplied them with knitted fabric at cost. So we softened the blow of retrenchment. So I can see, still see my office was fenced in because I had death threats, etc., with all these retrenchments and reorganization. And I can still see Ibram Patel, who was our erstwhile Minister of Trade and Industry, standing at the fence with his hands through the wire, shouting he was a member of the Textile Federation Union. So what were the value drivers of all this? And we had to think very hard as to value drivers. Just, I think the best example in the world of value driving was FedEx, who came to the conclusion that reliability was really their value driver. Because if they weren't reliable in delivering parcels and documents, they wouldn't build up a trustworthy business. So everything they did, they asked the question, is this reliable? Will it be seen to be reliable? We built up the value drivers were timeless, delivery, and quality. Because when you take natural fiber, say wool, and you mix it with chemicals, dye, you really don't know the full reaction that's going to be. I mean, what the exact color is. You're wearing a beautiful colored scarf there, Karen, if I may say so. But to get to that color is not easy. You've got to. So it was quality and timeless delivery, because if you're delivering to a dress manufacturer, they've got time to deliver to their customer. So it was timeless, and it was a question about quality driver. And then the business model. What was our business model? We started making sure the business model was developed through the three prisms of the economy, society, and the environment. So this was 35 years ago, and I was very aware of it. I think I've told the story before that to make a few yards of jean fabric, you need thousands of liters of water. So in our renewal of the plant and machinery, we got our Swiss manufacturers, Sulzer, to actually apply their minds from a design point of view to make a machine that could produce jean fabric with using much less water. And that machine is still operating to this day. And so that was something that was important. And then what was our purpose? Our purpose was actually to be the major supplier in the Southern Hemisphere in yarn and in fabric, especially in yarn, because yarn would go to other manufacturers in the Southern Hemisphere who would be making fabrics for their customers. So having agreed all that and having called board meetings and confirmed it, the question had to be decided, what was our governance framework? And we decided it had to be outcomes based. And mirabile dictu, the same as it is today. It's just my mind, I suppose. Being applied at the time, I said it has to be value-driven, but in a sustainable manner. So that was one. There had to be ethical and effective leadership. I wanted each director to accept that he or she was a guardian of this incapacitated company. It was absolutely dependent on their heart and their mind and their conscience. And if they were the guardian, as I put to them, of a 3-year-old child who'd become parentless because of an unfortunate motor car accident, and they were appointed the guardian of a 3-year-old child, what would they do? How would they look after the assets inherited by this child and plan for its long-term life? Exactly the same. You've got to have that thinking as a director of the company. So that was important from a governance point of view, which I started instilling in them. And then there was corruption in the company because had a system of, in the head office, I found about 120 people. They were invoicing all at different year-end invoicing, so that your final year-end from a financial point of view was different. Whatever was manufactured divided into 120 time slots, so you had different tax years. And I, within 2 years, got that down to exactly 3 companies. So you can imagine that reorganization, but it had to be done. And then I also made them realize that as directors and as a board, as a collective mind, it was a passive oversight, because what we were doing was looking at the financial statements drawn by whom? By management. Today, as well, the sustainability reports will be drawn by management, and you'll approve them. So the board is actually an approval body, and then it's passive oversight. And it becomes very important today. That's developed, my thinking then is developed into what is internationally known as an integrated report, where you have to accept that operationally the resources used by the company and the relationships are integrated 24/7. And so they should be reported. So when it became important to report on the sustainability issues, at the time I was chairman of the United Nations as well, on governance and oversight, and talking to IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. It was agreed that if you had these 2 silo reports, financial and sustainability, that it was divorced from reality. That in fact these things were integrated 24/7. Hence the integrated thinking that has gone around the world. And the Bastille of the primacy of the shareholder has been stormed by integrated thinking. And so that becomes critical. So induction then became important. I made sure that every director was inducted again and went through the various various processes of getting the raw material, the wool, the cotton, how it was spun, the spinning, the weaving, etc., etc. And every director went through a whole period of induction and learning. So they actually learnt about learnt about how the factory worked. So putting that all together, I, as chair, actually reorganized that board completely. The board started thinking about these long-term objectives. So in my office at the time, we had a whiteboard, and at the end was the long-term objective. from time to time, we had strategies to achieve what was necessary in the short term and the medium term. And those were tweaked from time to time. But the organization long-term objective stood at the end of that whiteboard, never changed. We were driven towards that. And what was happening along the way was the pathway to that. And eventually that was achieved. The borrowings were repaid to the banks. The company became profitable and once again successful. So that is my own story, Carolyn, of how I went about taking an underperforming board. And really it was underperforming because of the attitude of the previous major shareholder became deceased and formed this trust, locking in these three incompetent directors and with an instruction not to buy new plant machinery. It was unnecessary. And that was because he had a fight with his family and decided that when he died, the youngest grandchild was 3 years old, and he made inheritance subject to the youngest grandchild turning 50 years of age. And so that's something that I became a trustee also of the family trust and litigated about that, and again made legal history because actually got that changed because that just didn't make sense to anybody. And the children eventually inherited and the company succeeded. So that's my own story, and that's
Wow.
how I went about it, and it worked.
Thank you. Thank you. A whole lot of questions. First question, the board that you appointed, they could have been yes people, and just let you run and just were ratifying what it was that you were doing. Is that what you put in place as people that just supported what you were doing?
They're not. I absolutely expected every director individually to discuss matters, and I made sure they understand. And I think, Karen, you know how I has to do that. Is discuss let's say, a short-term objective with a strategy. And on the agenda was the possible resolution. I'd say, well, we've been talking about this for 40 minutes. I think the inclination of the board is to pass the agenda as the resolution as is on item 5 on the agenda. Is that agreed? Yes, Chair, yes, Chair, yes, Chair. And I would just pick you, Carolyn, and say, would you please explain to me in great detail why you voted yes? Now, if you hadn't understood the management report and you hadn't followed the 40 minutes of discussion, you'd sit there with a second row of teeth. And all you've got to do is do that a few times in the board. And first of all, you get absolute control of the board. And secondly, homework does improve. They actually do spend time going through that board packet and, more importantly, understanding it. Because the director who doesn't understand what's going on is actually committing a fraud on the company. Because he's the guardian and he is the mind of the company and making decisions in the best long-term interests of the health of the company. So very important, this question of understanding. And that's why another important job of chairman, which I carried out there, was to make sure that reports coming up from management were clear, concise, and understandable in everyday English, not in the jargon developed, which does develop in companies, with acronyms, but absolutely clear, concise, and understandable.
And then there's management level information as opposed to governance information, getting that balance right as well in the reports.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You have to do that. And I mean, I think management used to start, I don't know if they hated me, but they're certainly on their toes because I used to send reports back, redo it, redo it, redo it before I would approve the pack going into. So I work very closely with the company secretary, and she became famous in South Africa as company secretary. She did very well. Yeah.
One of the first things you did was you did a skills assessment, and then you dismissed directors. The skills assessment obviously was the skills required for the company. And was that an independent party that came in and assisted you with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm.
Well,
And
it did to be me, but also there was the check on me with the round robin resolutions. So I wasn't operating there as a dictator. There were checks and balances.
and then getting rid of a director. I see did you have to change the articles or the memorandum of incorporation first before you moved those directors on, or?
The answer is yes. The memorandum of incorporation never had that. And I got it changed at this extraordinary general meeting to get me going on what I wanted to do with the company. And I had the board had the right to dismiss and appoint directors subject to round robin resolution. So you didn't have the time and cost of a listed company calling a special general meeting or a general meeting.
How do you go about dismissing a director?
With pain and suffering. I've always said being the chair is horrific, it's not honorific. And one thing I've learned as chairman of companies is that you've got to be a bit arm's length with your fellow directors, because in another company of which I was chair, I had to get rid of the group chief executive, but his wife and my wife had become friendly, played bridge together, and we had dinners together. And it became a painful exercise to dismiss him. So what did I learn? I learned that, of course, you've got to be collegiate, but you've got to be a bit arm's length as chair.
I've got some other questions here. What are the key factors boards should prioritize to mitigate underperformance in today's complex and fast-changing business environments? That's from Samkita. So what are the key factors that you prioritize to make sure that it doesn't happen?
Well, first of all, you've got to have very clear in your mind what your governance framework is inside the company. And you've got to have very clear, and the company must be driving towards that, what I call that long-term objective, which really should not change. And you just drive towards those things, but within the governance framework which you've laid down, which today I think most companies operate on an outcomes-based form of governance. Not many. It's no longer this rules-based grudge compliance and mindlessly ticking boxes. It's a mindful application of mind in achieving the long-term objective.
And a question from Michael in the Q&A. I'm missing some of your questions in the chat, so please do put them in the Q&A. And we've got a lot of questions. So to the audience, please just thumbs up if you like a question. It goes to the top for me, and then we can start from those that most people want to ask. But there's a question here from Michael. Michael asks, what would your practical guidance be on ensuring that governance is embedded in everyday operations? So I guess that's the integrated nature, to ensure it consistently understood and implemented throughout the organization at different levels of management and operations. And I must just give you a bit of background to this. So Michael is heading up a project within the South African Bureau of Standards to look at the maturity of governance policies. So in that, how do you make sure you've got that integrated governance through the organization?
You make sure that your interim management reports are actually fitting in with that governance framework and are integrated in the sense of putting together the three critical pillars of sustainable development, dealing with the economy, society, and the environment as you're going along with your short-term and medium-term objectives, not waiting till the end of the fiscal period. So in operationally, you start thinking along and viewing things through these three prisms for sustainable development. And so the whole thinking of the company changes from a management point of view. And that's why I always say integrated thinking has gone around the world, and the major standard setters, they've all accepted the question of integrated thinking. But it doesn't come from the bottom up. It doesn't come from management up. It comes once the board has decided to do an integrated report and starts thinking of things and reviews the business model, for example, and looks at it on an integrated basis, because most business models had been done thinking in silos. And think of it on integrated, so you review the business model and then it starts going right through the company, the question of integrated thinking. And well, research and now reality has shown that you actually start improving the bottom line as well, because you actually start reducing expenditure once you get that integration.
So you're not overlapping and you haven't got these gaps where things are falling through. So maybe just a comment to Michael, in your governance projects, I guess that's you need to make sure that your policies are all integrated as well. They talk to each other so that so that your guidance doesn't have those gaps either.
Absolutely.
And I know that Michael's running a survey. So, Michael, if you could just put that survey link into the chat function, that would be great. And people can then respond to that. I've got, and let's see how many people. We've got 320 odd people online. Let's see how many people we can get responding to that survey. That would be great. Here's a question from Les. Les is saying you touched on the board executive management relationships, and he's found, or they've found that this is a common destructive element which needed to be balanced. So productive challenges aren't stifled. Would you care to comment? And Les is dialing in here from Australia.
Well, people must realize boards don't do things. Boards think, boards approve. They don't do, management does. So boards will think of a strategy or a business judgment call for something to be done. The chief executive leads the management team that implements those things. Now, you've got this, what I call passive oversight, because you approve, the board approves of what management has done in trying to carry out that business judgment call conclusion that the board has come to do something. Inevitably, you're going to get clashes sometimes between the doers and the thinkers. And so you have to, and that's where it's so important to have boards made up of independent non-executive directors who can see the wood for the trees, and executive directors who actually have the capacity to think, I'm employed by the company by way of contract. I'm now sitting here as a director, which is a statutory appointment. I've got to take that cap off of my relationship as an employee and think of now acting in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. You might even have to make a decision which is against one of his colleagues in the business. But it's a completely different function that the executive director. And then, of course, coming together to make the collective board decision. But inevitably, you're going to get that clash between management and the board. And sometimes executive directors sit and they're not sure about
Where they sit.
where they're sitting and where they should go. And actually, it's also the chairman plays a great role there because he realizes the dilemma that the executive is sitting in, and
Yes.
actually helps him and coaches him along and takes him along with the decision. But he's got to make a decision in the best interest of the company. That's his duty, and he owes the duty sitting there as a director to the company. When he goes back to his office job, he owes his duty to his superior. He's got to report to his superior and eventually to the board. But he doesn't report to the company. It's a different, and you're going to get conflicts, and
Yes.
you deal with those conflicts. And sometimes it does land in the lap of the chairman, and you've got to deal with it.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've come across quite a lot is that in IT and technology, is there's so much opportunity now to leverage companies where that is their stick to your knitting, stick to your knitting. That's their core business. But the company's CEO, for whatever reason, or chief information officer decides to install their own infrastructure with their own specialist team, expensive, not leveraging all of this other functionality out there and all of these other organizations out there. And I think that's got to be a critical question, really, is to understand is what is in the best, is it just creating your own empire by employing all of these people and it's all about control, or are you acting in the best long-term interests of the organization in leveraging and developing the ability to leverage a supply chain? Of course, there's pros and cons of both of those, so you're going to have a bit of a debate on your hands, aren't you?
Well, it's a good example, Karen, here of integrated thinking. Because if you've really got integrated thinking, that shouldn't happen.
Okay. That you should think and tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, if you're thinking on an integrated basis, these resources and these relationships are all integrated operationally eventually, even though he's building his own little empire. So they should be talking to each other and integrated on thinking on an integrated basis. If you think on an integrated basis, you don't build an empire based on the natural assets or an empire based on IT and a little empire based on. Then you've got these silos and they're not talking to each other. And you don't get, and then to do an integrated report becomes almost impossible in there because you haven't got the information, you haven't got the source of information. And you don't have the data points talking
Yes.
technically.
You haven't done that integrated thinking.
Exactly.
That's a role of the chair then to get that coming through, to point it out. Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming through. Thank you very much, everyone. Please keep upticking them so I know which ones to ask. Here we've got one, Vortex from Chandu. There's actually quite a few questions around this. And that's the concept of a captured board, essentially where we have directors not making decisions in the best interest of the organization. And there's quite a few of that, quite a few questions. I think I saw one in the chat. Behavior of a forceful shareholder when engaging at a board level. So chairman, how do you deal with, navigate the shareholder, bringing an influence in? I think there was one earlier on here. Greater engagement between the directors in the meetings. So quite a few on that, questions of the concept of a captured board, essentially, that there's this groupthink almost, perhaps as the influence of a forceful shareholder.
And to be a good director, the most important thing is courage. You have to be brave because you have to meet things head on, and you have to make sure decisions are being made in the long-term best interests of this incapacitated person that's so dependent on you. And so you've got to meet these things head on, and it takes courage. So it's one of the corporate sins, I believe, that some directors think this business judgment call that we're discussing, it's very risky. It may turn out to be wrong in a few years' time. I'm going to abstain. Well, what happens? That's a corporate sin, because abstaining doesn't help the company make that decision with unanimity,
It only
which
helps
you
self.
really need. You think of yourself
Mm.
and protecting yourself from a possible action when something goes wrong. But if you follow the business judgment rule that you've got no financial interest, objectively speaking, you've got all the facts, and it was a rational business decision at that time in those circumstances. The law doesn't say it's got to be the correct decision, which it says rational business decision at that time in those circumstances. And that's why today boards have to, when they're saying, well, what are the facts? They better go to ChatGPT research and ask the question, get it, because you can assure when something goes wrong in 4 years' time, they say, the board made that decision. Company sue the board for damage. Company sue the directors for damages. What did you ask ChatGPT research? No, we
Did
didn't
you
ask.
ask Google?
No. Did you ask Google? Did you? So you have to do that technological research today to say, to pass that hurdle of, objectively speaking, we had all the facts to enable us to make this decision, which was a
Mm.
rational one at that time.
Mm. Using Google and ChatGPT, yes, we said it flippantly, but really, it's have you become informed yourself to make the decision, and through whatever means, um, just to become informed. So
Then
being
there's the
yeah.
obligation of having original intellectual thinking as a director. So
Mm.
you've got to take that answer you get from ChatGPT. You've got to take it, or Grok, or whatever, whoever you ask to get the question. And it's very interesting. Sometimes you ask Grok and you ask
Get
Meter or
different.
somebody, you get slightly different. It's quite interesting. But you've got to interrogate it. I mean, you just can't take that information and use it. You've got to interrogate it with original intellectual thinking to make that decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. And you've got to be seen to be doing it, because if it turns out to be wrong in 4 years' time and the company sues you for damages, well, you can show, I went to Grok, I went to this, I did that, and we discussed it.
Lucy asks, what about resolving dominance on the board, where one director is clearly dominating the conversation? And then I'm going to go to the next question, is about what about lobbying? Because that dominant director might have been lobbied. Do you feel that lobbying is ethical when it comes to board decisions?
The question of dominance in the boardroom is usually through the chief executive, who becomes a executive director, or it's through the independent non-executive director that's playing second fiddle to the chair, that if the chair's ill or something, he takes over as chair.
Mm.
So he becomes the leading independent non-executive director. You find dominance comes either from the chief executive or that lead independent director, but they are directors. They're not there to dominate, they're there to give input and to make it a collective mind decision. So the chair has got to watch that for that dominance, and actually he's got to cut that dominance down. You've got to cut his feet off if necessary at the board meeting and say, you keep saying this and you're actually trying to take over give a chance to the other director to speak and I'll come back to you. Just wait a minute.
And what do you
And
feel about lobbying?
And lobbying is very dangerous. It's absolutely dangerous, and you've got to be aware of it. And if it's something being lobbied in the best long-term interest of the health of the company, that's one thing. But if lobbying is contrary to a decision which has been made, then you start getting conflicts, and that's not in the interest of the company, long-term interest of the company.
There's a last question before we go on to some other case studies. A couple of points. First of all, Prem asks, we really need a book about the frame group and what you did on the frame group. So maybe we can take this recording and we can expand on it and we can put some flesh on that and come up with an article or some guidance as a result. But let me go on to the others. What happens when you've got, well, really the question is about voting. What happens if you got board members that disagree on a strategy? You said you got that golden strategy on the wall, and although you had different, perhaps changed the approaches as you navigated through the journey, you still had that strategy. But what happens if you've got directors that disagree with that strategy, and it had to result in a vote? Do directors, something as significant as that, do you get them to vote openly or rather anonymously? And how do you feel about voting?
Well, I've never found, once a board has agreed both through an offline discussion and then back to the board, that long-term objective, and you drive towards that. Only in very extraordinary circumstances would you change that long-term objective, because a lot of the work has almost been wasted. So first of all, it's unlikely. Secondly, if it does happen, that means you've got to change the whole thinking of the board. You've got to change exactly the pathway you're traveling on, and you've got to change the long-term objective, if you think that's in the long-term best interest of the health of the company. So it's a real turnaround where you might need other skills on the board as well. So it's it would be a rupture in the company. And so I have not seen that happen in my years of experience, but it could happen, I suppose. But I think once you achieve, spoken for days, weeks, months, and that long-term objective, and you've gone for a good few years building towards that, and sold plant and machinery, closed factories in Blantyre and East London, and Harrismith, destroyed the town of Harrismith. I mean, I'll never forget how the mayor came begging to me not to close the factory in Harrismith, because it really did destroy that town.
As you said, horrific, not honorific.
Yeah, exactly. So so I think it's an unusual circumstance, that question, but it could happen. But then you've got to rethink and reorganize the whole structure of the board, etc.
How do you feel about voting at a board level?
To me, it must be open.
And
Why must a board vote secretively?
it doesn't build trust.
No.
And then if you get a 51% vote, how comfortable are you with that kind of a result?
Very uncomfortable. Because as chair, you should strive like crazy to get that unanimity in the board. If necessary, tweak the strategy for the short-term objective. Tweak it so that you get this unanimity, because otherwise you don't get that drive going through the board and board into management. And so unanimity is a critical issue. And if you have board meetings where you have a majority vote every board meeting, just imagine. I mean, the board is actually not functioning because that collective mind has got gaps in it and dents in it all over the place. You should strive as the chair to get that unanimity, that unanimous vote. And
There are a couple
I
of,
think you can go through the minute books of companies, great companies. You will hardly ever see a dissenting vote.
And I mean, that talks to a couple of questions that we have here. And I think the suggestion is, can we have a webinar specifically on what do you do when you've got a dysfunctional chairman? Because everything you're talking about is taking the helm. It's the chair, and the tone comes from the chair, and the chair has to drive so much of this. Not so much as the CEO of the board, but the facilitator and the enabler, essentially, of the board, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why some state-owned enterprises, one of the reasons they have failed is that the government persists in passing a statute, and through a statute creating a legal person like Eskom, Transnet, or form a company, and of which the sole shareholder is the government, and then has the right written into the statute or into the MOI of, if it's a company, under the Companies Act, that they've got the right to appoint the chairman and the chief executive. Well, the chairman arrives at the board meeting with 2 pips on his shoulder. He's the leader of the board, and he's also the sole shareholder. So if you don't agree with me, we can always call a shareholders general meeting of shareholders and have the whole board removed. And one of the most important jobs of a board is the appointment of the chief executive, because he's leading the management team, carrying out the decisions of the board. So it is really one of the most critical things. And if the shareholder appoints the chief executive, then you've got this extraordinary situation when something goes wrong, the directors get sued, and the shareholders sits and says,
The directors get sued.
Yeah, the directors get sued, and the shareholders don't, say, don't split authority and responsibility. You've got to be very careful in that appointment. And unfortunately, what's happened in many of our SAEs, you've had the split of authority and responsibility. So the chairman arrives with, as I say, 2 pips on his shoulder. So disagree with him. So this is not a chairman who actually can function properly, because he's probably taking instructions himself from the sole shareholder. And then he's not an intellectually honest chairman who's trying to get the board to make a decision in the long-term best interest of the health of the company, which results in trade-offs between the various stakeholders during the year that can change the next year, for example.
I've thrown some thoughts up onto a couple of slides, and it would be great to get your, if that's okay, get your feedback on that. I just want to see here. So
Volkswagen is a great case example.
the Volkswagen one.
That was where they did all the regulators and authorities around the world on the emissions, carbon emissions. I think that's what you've got there.
Yes, that's it. That's the one. Yes.
And
So there's
Volkswagen's reputation suffered enormously, and it took a long time to correct it. Barclays was the LIBOR scandal, where it was alleged they fiddled with the LIBOR rates. It was Barclays and somebody else. I think it was Standard Chartered. I can't remember. But
yeah, some examples. And then just so that these are also, you say use ChatGPT. So this is trying to become informed myself. So these are some of the critical challenges that that are picked up around chairs, and you've mentioned some of these. So that psychological safety, it sounds very airy-fairy and motherhood and apple pie. But really what you were talking about was making sure that the board can all speak. And by pointing to a board member and say, you need to justify this, you giving them power essentially to speak. There you've got your board skills audit, exactly what you said, how you started.
Yeah, but Enron is a fascinating case because when Enron eventually collapsed, having been the darling of the American stock exchanges, they went on to establish Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX. So actual legislation on how to do things, like our Public Finance Management Act. Has SOX stopped corporate failures, stopped corporate scandals? The answer is no. The same as our PFMA hasn't stopped corporate collapses. You can't legislate for honesty. I mean, the government can't today pass an act from Parliament saying from tomorrow, every director shall act honestly in the best long-term interests of the health of the company and shall be intellectually honest, otherwise you'll go to jail for 20 years. Well,
Is that why the King reports have never been legislated?
absolutely. I've been dead against it. Been asked to legislate it. And I said no, because it's peer pressure is much more effective. And it's much more effective in the capital markets of the world. If they see you carrying out mindful governance with outcomes based and you're achieving those four critical outcomes: value creation in a sustainable manner, ethical and effective leadership, accountability with good internal controls, and there's trust and confidence in the community in which the company operates, and they think you're a responsible corporate citizen. Well, you've practiced good governance. But that kind of audit is now done in the capital markets of the world. So you mindlessly tick a box to comply with the statute. You spending your time on compliance instead of performance. And so you actually, I think statutes like the PFA become counterproductive. And I think market forces and reputation in the marketplace much more important for long-term success than
Yes.
having tick boxes of a piece of legislation. And Sarbanes-Oxley has shown that and proved that point, I think. And the PFMA has proved that point here in South Africa.
Yes. Some structures, some strategies, performance reviews. You said skills audits, but performance reviews as well.
Absolutely. You must have performance reviews.
Decision-making processes and information flows around, and that's where you were talking about the executive director actually knowing more because of the insights. And you also mentioned all the sites, the insights, the foresight, the oversight, the hindsight, all of the sites in the
It
board.
becomes important when it comes to internal audit and your internal control systems. Because the profession of internal audit was a hindsight profession. Something went wrong and they created another system so that it didn't happen. Hopefully it didn't happen again. Then it was insight. They saw, how they could help to make, if decisions were being made by the management, they would sit in with management, but not be part of management, but tell management, look, I can't cope with this. If you want to do this, I need another kind of skill not only an accounting skill, I need another kind of skill in my internal auditing. And then foresight is where they actually don't become part of management and become part of that decision-making process, but actually can say, well, you can do this, but I think we've got to reorganize this internal control or that internal control. So it's become a question of foresight and the garden of governance, which is now Randall Lenz has written his book, and I've written the foreword to it, as you know, Carol. And that book is starting to revolutionize the thinking about internal auditing. And and what is fascinating is a lot of companies today have got a hybrid internal audit system. So they've got the corporate audit executive. So he's still available, to quote an executive in this country said, to sniff in the passages what's going wrong in the company. But they've got to apply their modern technologies in creating the internal control systems today. Now, most companies cannot afford that to buy that technology. So you become a hybrid where you've got your internal auditor, you've got your corporate audit executive, and you've got one of the big four also, because they've got the balance sheet and they're up to date with technology. So they work together in working out the internal control systems. Then they planned with the external auditor that's got this statutory obligation to audit and does audit, but takes a lot of information now from internal audit, so reduces the cost of the external audit. And that's what's happening today.
Mm. Prof, we've run out of time. There are so many questions still. We've got 25 unanswered questions in the Q&A as well as those in the chat. We are going to have another session. Please watch out, join our mailing list, join our community. You can join for free, and then find out our next episode, next webinar in the series with Prof King. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And Prof King, thank you so much for your time and wisdom and sharing that with us today. Thank you, everyone.